All right. So continuing our conversation last week, up until now, we've been really talking about the biological processes, and we started moving as we got into learning and memory, just how some of the mental representations form within our brain. And again, we don't really have a science that picks those images out, or it's not like a video where we can tap into the video line, and then see what is going on, the images and the memories and the sensations or perceptions even that are going on in that person's mind. Okay, we don't have that capability. So what we do is we develop theories and concepts for these, and cognition is one of them. Okay, so when we get into cognition is just really a fancy way to say thinking. Okay, when somebody's thinking, they're engaged in cognition. They're using their cognitive abilities to solve problems, to come up with solutions, to ask questions, to just very a different way of seeing the world through problem-solving abilities. Okay, because again, looking at our evolutionary background, we are problem solvers. If something is not working and we're not meeting our goals of getting food and shelter, we have to come up with solutions to do that. And we see that across many animals within the reptilian and mammal kingdom, right? We see that they have problems. Some of them even use tools in order to solve their problems, right? So humans are no different. So we come up with mental images of what our solution looks like, and then we find a way to meet those goals. And we're going to talk about some of those concepts here today. So, and then we're going to discuss intelligence and what that means and how we test that. And hopefully we'll have some time at the end of this course here. But I want you, while we're doing this, think about what intelligence is. How do we define it? Try not to use your book. How do you define it? And what milestones or systems can we test to mark whether somebody is intelligent or not? Because that's going to be important. That'll be our class activity at the end of this. If hopefully, I'm pretty sure we'll have time here. All right, Madison, I see that you added that GoFundMe. It's in the chat. Thank you for adding that. Everybody, please copy that down and help out in either way, either donations or help spread that on social media or whatever you use. Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate that a lot.
Of course, anything we can do to help. All right. Share my screen. There we go. All right. So as promised, we're going to talk about cognition today. Let me move some stuff around here. I'm not going to walk through each one of these learning objectives. Oops. I am not sure what I just did. I think it just jumped me right to the beginning. All right, let me back out of this. I apologize. I accidentally clicked on one of those objectives and it took me right where I didn't want to go. All right. Don't you love technology? Isn't it great? There we go. All right, try this again. All right. So as I said, thinking or cognition is just a fancy way of talking about thinking and intelligence, and then even how we develop language. And we're going to end on intelligence today, and then maybe pick up where we left off on language next week. Okay. So how people think. We have different ways of coming up with thinking. Okay. So or the concept of thinking. So we define thinking as mental activity for organizing, understanding, and communicating. Okay. That's the important one there, is communication, because we can think all day, right? Similar to learning. We can say somebody's learning something, right? We can see them looking at a book, and as an educator, I can vouch for this. Just because somebody has a book and they're looking at a book, they're not necessarily engaged in thinking or learning, right? We can't ascertain that until we evaluate them somehow, ask them to repeat what it is that they learned, or regurgitate some information that they may have read. Once they've done that, we can ascertain whether or not that learning has occurred. Similar to thinking, if they don't show some kind of understanding or some kind of organization through behavior or communicate that in some way, we really have no idea how thinking is occurring unless they show us somehow. So keep that in mind as we go through some of these concepts here. So mental imagery. When we get into developmental psychology, I think next week, I believe, we're going to talk about mental imagery and mental representation, because we're not born with mental representation. It's something we have to develop over time. And as we learn language, it solidifies our understanding of what mental representation is. All right, so what is mental representation and mental images? So for example, you see this guy, somebody says breakfast, okay? And he conjures up this beautiful plate of 3 eggs sunny side up and hash browns, and it looks like bacon there. And so he's got an idea of what breakfast looks like. And that's what mental representation is. If we use words and we convert that to symbols, we've just engaged in mental imagery, okay? One of the processes I like to use with my therapy is guided imagery. Has anybody heard of guided imagery or done guided imagery before?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. What is guided imagery? What did they ask you to do, or what did you do? I'm not sure if you used it yourself or somebody used it with you.
It's with the person who I did it with, it's kind of like just envisioning a certain scenario or a certain place, and just kind of being guided through the imagery of that, and kind of thinking about the details, and kind of meant to just center yourself in the imagery.
Exactly. That's exactly what that is. Because if we can picture it, we can believe it. If we believe it, our body reacts certain ways to that. And it's very helpful with stress reduction. And even in some cases, people suffering with some kind of past trauma or formerly diagnosed with PTSD. It helps them bring their mind and their body back to a space that's good and safe and tranquil, especially when they're being triggered by certain events, external events, or thoughts or something like that, invasive thoughts. So guided imagery is just that, picturing something, using words to picture a place that's tranquil, peaceful, and safe while your body is activated. So that usually helps to reduce that activation and calm that person down. And it's a great skill. It's a great practice for any kind of stress reduction. So that's just the power of mental imagery and how we use that. But sometimes, mental imagery doesn't really work out. It's not really a positive thing sometimes, right? Especially if it conjures up ideas of negative things. So and we'll explore some of those examples later. But for example, if I think we used this last week, if I say the word banana and I tell you not to think of the word banana, you can't not think about it, right? It's there, it's in your brain. It's the first thing that's on your mind, okay? Because you're picturing that even when I say not to. So sometimes we just can't get mental images out of our eyes or out of our minds, right? So how does mental imagery work, and what does that mean for us? What it does is it tends to, we see a reaction time that is much slower the more thought process we put into things. And we kind of know that, right? We've seen that within ourselves. When something really challenging comes up for us, what do? We sit and we think about it for a little bit, right? Whereas something easy comes up and we make a snap judgment. And we'll talk about that here when we're making shortcuts and using things like heuristics to make those mental shortcuts. But for somebody that's engaged in serious thought and problem solving, we can say that they spend more time in that moment. So, for example, fictional island Kosslyn did was created an island and asked the person to get to a certain point based on where they currently were. So, for example, they may have them on the southwest side of that island there, right next to what looks like that, I think a pavilion of some sort, right? So when they asked a person to draw a line to get to either that house or that pavilion, they saw that reaction time was pretty quick, okay? They didn't have to really engage in any kind of mental imagery or take think through that process. They knew exactly where they were going. They drew that line directly to those 2 points. However, when they started asking that person to go a little bit further out, like maybe to the tree or to the lake or to the other shore, or maybe even up to looks like some kind of field up there in the northern part, their reaction time took longer. So they either delayed on drawing that initial line to that house or that pavilion, and then it took even longer to get to one of those other points. So the further out they went, the longer that reaction time took to get to that initial point, because they were mapping out, they're imagining that in their head. So we know that it is a process, and the more complex it is, the longer it takes us. It should take us, because we have to think our way through. And when we make snap decisions and engage in heuristics, that could lead us to some dangerous things, or not sound advice sometimes, right? All right. So with your book mentions concepts and prototypes. Just to kind of break these down. So we all, like the individual we saw earlier that we asked to imagine breakfast, he had an idea of what breakfast would be. Now, how does that change from culture to culture? Is there a different idea of what breakfast is in say the United States versus Ireland, or versus Germany, or China? Yeah, everybody has a different idea of what breakfast is. Okay, so if we say the word breakfast, everybody conjures up something we eat in the morning. There are some similarities across many cultures, right? This one uses the example of drugs. We say the word drug. Across many cultures, it means different things. So what we start engaging in is prototypes. We look at prototypes to tell us what exactly defines a drug for us. And in this case, somebody, if we say the word drug, they might think automatically, if we ask them to come up with examples, they would say marijuana, alcohol, pills, right? All right. So well, actually, I'm going to hold off on that activity until the end here. So anyway, using certain words and then thinking of what examples, those examples would be those prototypes, okay, that speaks to us. All right, so problem solving and decision-making strategies. Everybody has a different approach to problem solving. Some people might be unique. Some people might follow mainstream, other ways that people problem solve. So for example, if you received I'm not, hopefully this isn't happening to anybody, but if you received a bill saying that your last payment is overdue, how do you approach that? Many people would approach that very differently, right? Some people might call the company and say, hey, can I get an extension? Or, hey, I paid this, what's going on? Or I forgot about it. Some people might just mail it in and not ask any questions, right? They may not even look at their checkbook to see if they did pay that in the past. So everybody has a different approach to dealing with that. Unfortunately, some people would probably say, hopefully nobody in this room would say, yeah, I'm not going to pay that. I know people that do that. They get bills and it's almost like this oppositional effect happens that they say, I'm not going to pay that bill, which, the credit card companies always win in the end. So it's not a very good problem solving strategy. But problem solving is using that cognition to kind of picture, using those images in a way that you can picture what that end result gets to or looks like and how you're going to get there. Now, what happens sometimes, maybe somebody can answer this for me. What happens sometimes when somebody has an idea of what they need to do, but they don't know the steps they need to take to get there? Has anybody seen that happen before? We have an idea of what we need to do. We just don't know the steps we need to take to get there.
Yeah, I'm in one of those positions right now.
Okay. Is that something, are you okay sharing that?
Yeah, so I'm trying to sign up for the ROTC program at the college I'm going to in August, but I don't know how to sign up for the ROTC program.
Okay, good. That's a great example. So you have an idea of what you want to do, you just don't know what steps to get there. If you don't mind me asking, what is your strategy for attaining that goal? Because right now you don't have the steps. You know what you want to do, you don't have the steps. You've imagined it. What is your next step in solving this issue, this problem?
I'm going to be calling the college later today and finding out how to sign up for the program.
Okay, okay. So using what we call in learning, what we call a tutor, right? We have an idea of what we're doing. We're in close proximity of that. This is a zone of proximal development, right, of learning. Victor, oh my gosh, I forgot the name. Holy cow. Anyway, we'll get back to that when we get into developmental psychology. Vygotsky. Oh my gosh. Okay. I should know this by heart. So anyway, we look at Vygotsky's zone of proximal development and learning. And we see that we have an idea of what we're doing, and we just need somebody to kind of guide us and get us that information. That's a great strategy. If you don't have that answer, find somebody that does, and they can give you the steps in order to do that, right? So that's an example of problem solving and decision making. Some people use trial and error, and that's okay, right? Because we've learned that from a young age. We've learned circular patterns, doing things, sticking around somewhere in the middle of what we're comfortable with and moving around in patterns until we get what we want, what we either physically or whatever the case may be. We just have a way of trying things until we get one that works for us. And it's a great way of learning. The downside is what? It takes too long, right? Sometimes we may not have all the resources available to us, and trying different things may not lead us to the result that we want. So trial and error, while it is a great way to learn, can come at a cost with exerting too much time and effort. Algorithms, kind of what Joey was talking about, specific steps for solving certain problems, right? Is there a prescribed way of doing this? For example, in order to get to an ROTC program, you have to submit a paper saying that you qualify. You have to maybe put in a resume. You have to have that package evaluated. You have to maybe maintain certain physical fitness standards, right? There's a prescription for a way to reach those goals, right? And that's the use of algorithms, that when we have a certain way to do that. And sometimes we don't know how to do that, and doing trial and error would take way too long. So finding somebody that does have that information, or finding a publication, or maybe even a website, would be helpful in finding whether or not finding that algorithm, those certain steps, right? Heuristics. So, we have a lecture activity for this. So heuristics is really a guess based on experience. So they say rule of thumb here in quote unquote. So the three types that your book described is availability heuristics, representative heuristics, and working backward. So let's see here, what we got here. I don't like this activity. I'll just go back and explain this. I apologize. All right, return back to lecture. How do I get back to lecture? All right. So availability heuristics is information that is based on, or a decision that we make based on the information that is available to us. Okay. So for example, how many of you think that that child abductions have increased over the last 30 years? How many of you would say that?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Anybody disagree with that?
Well, I used to think so until last time we talked about it.
Oh, we did talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, we did. Okay. We didn't talk about heuristics, did we?
No, not that way, no. But I know I mentioned about that, like you asked about some of the things that we sometimes are too worried about, and I mentioned about, that I agree with that. But
Okay.
the statistics show that it actually is not as bad as it used to be before.
Yeah. So that's info. Okay, and we're circling back around to that as to where that comes from. That comes from what? That comes from information that's provided to us through our, we have our cell phones that have Amber Alerts. We have Amber Alerts up on the highway signs. They come over our TV and radios. We hear about them in the news, right? So it's pretty available. That information is very much available to us. So we make decisions based on that. And indeed, actual child abductions have gone down. We do the same thing with flying. A lot of people base whether or not they're going to fly on how dangerous they think it is. And we make assumptions that it's really dangerous. Why? because we see that in the news. We see a plane crash, and that affects people's decision to actually fly, when indeed it's probably one of the safest modes of transportation that we have available, right? So that's availability heuristics. Representative heuristics is when we make a decision based on characteristics and qualities that are kind of typecast into that role. And I'm going to get to that here in just a minute. I've got a great example to use with that. And then we have working backward. So basically, with working backward heuristics, we see the problem, and we with the problem, we work backwards until it's fixed. Okay, so kind of like a trial and error, we just make guesses. We don't really use data or information that's available. We're just guessing to use that strategy. As I said, with the representative heuristics, oops, there we go. So for example, if I asked you to estimate or guess what the professions would be of these two people that you see on your screen right now, what would you say?
I would say Raheem, probably a basketball player.
Okay. Anybody else think basketball player for him? He's probably the most readily, I think most people go right to the gentleman on the right, right? So why basketball player? Why would we make that assumption?
Really tall.
Okay. So he's tall, and he's got kind of a muscular physique, rather, right? So we might make assumptions based on certain characteristics. Okay, what's the fallacy in that? What's the problem with making those assumptions?
It might not be true.
Right, it might not be true. It might be somewhat offensive to say that to somebody. For example, I've done this, unfortunately. Anybody, you all know what Target is, right? You've been to Target. If I'm looking for something and I see somebody with a red shirt, I've done this. I go up to that person and ask them the question, do you know where this is? Or can you tell me, point me in the right direction or whatever? Because my assumption is what? That they're wearing a red shirt, that they work at Target, right? And then they turn around and there's nothing, there are no name tags or anything. But anyway, so just a life lesson: don't wear red shirts in Target if you don't want to be bothered. So anyway, that's representative heuristics. When we're making certain guesses and decisions based on what our past experiences have been. Okay, so heuristics are great if we have to make a fast decision, if there's really a low threat of being wrong, right? Offending somebody, that might be not a great thing, right? But we do that in kind of an unconscious in an unconscious way. We don't think about it so much, right? It's pretty automatic, and it is oftentimes error prone. So that's the downside to that. So that's why I said, if there's no risk involved and we have to make a snap decision on something, heuristics might be okay, right? But if we're making complex decisions, that might be a little bit more of an issue. So if we're not using heuristics and we're looking through a decision-making process, it might take a little bit longer. We're gonna have to put more thought into it. It's gonna require effort and collaboration with others, but we find that the results are oftentimes gonna be reliable and better informed. So those are the dangers with the heuristics. So similar to what we talked about with like the ROTC program, what Joey brought up, with problem solving and decision making, we break our goals into sub goals, right? So whatever our overarching goal is, maybe we want to be a doctor someday, a medical doctor someday. What do we have to do in order to achieve those steps? What I have to go to biomedical with an emphasis on medical. I have to take the MCATs, right? There are certain things that you have to do to study for in order to meet those goals. So, and we find that people that are able to create these sub goals oftentimes are more successful in meeting their long-term goals. However, using insight, which is a sudden perception of a solution to a problem, what the slide says here is an aha moment, could be dangerous, right? We may have similar to using the trial and error. We may get to that, but we're going to be making a lot of mistakes in the end, which could be bad. Okay, so insight is easy to go to, but oftentimes unreliable. All right, so when we're making decisions in problem solving, we are opening ourselves up to like confirmation bias, especially when we're using like availability heuristics. So for example, if somebody decided not to get into a car, they decided to walk instead because they just felt a little off, and they felt like said, I just don't want to be in the car, something doesn't feel right. And then that car gets into an accident. What do you think that person's explanation is for why they had those thoughts? How would that person explain what thoughts they had in making that decision? And what is that going to do next time for them? Maybe I'm not asking it.
They had like a
like,
gut
listen
feeling
to
something would happen.
Yeah, they have a gut feeling, right? They might have a sixth sense about this. That these are things that they're telling themselves. So therefore, what are they going to do? They're going to trust that insight. They're going to trust that gut feeling when they're making other decisions, right? Even though it had nothing to do with the fact that that car got into an accident and people might have been hurt. So we see that a lot when people they see what they want to see, and they use the evidence that fits their beliefs, right? While ignoring evidence that's not fitting their beliefs. So what's going to happen the next time they have that gut feeling? They're going to probably be a little bit more argumentative, and they're going to use the evidence from previous situation to confirm what they, hence confirmation bias, confirm what they once believed. Using mental sets is it persists in using past problem solving patterns. I see this in mental health all the time. People think that there is a certain way that they should deal with grief. They're dealing with the grief or the loss of a loved one based on how they dealt with the past one, or somebody else handled it, right? Parenting. I see this with parenting styles. Well, this worked for my first child. Why is it not working for my second child or my third child? So we get into these mental sets, and people with that lock into mental sets tend to have less flexibility and less ability to think outside the box, divergent thinking, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit, in order to come up with a better solution. So people that lock into mental sets tend to stay there unless, kind of going into physics, unless acted upon by an outside force, either necessity or somebody is telling them that something is wrong. So anyway, that can go very many ways with that. So that's what mental sets are, and that's the danger in using them. Functional fixedness, thinking about only the most typical functions of an object. I'm going to see if this is, I think we did this one already. Oops. Oh, what happened there? Okay, so functional fixedness, that lecture activity is not working for me. All right, so looking outside the box for the solution, right? So functional fixedness we see when people kind of like that mental set. They use the same problem solving over and over. So we only see one, the item for, I think we saw the candle box. I think that's what this is. No, that's not what that is. So on the next slide, you'll see various items on the desk to be presented with the problem to be solved. So let's see who's able to break through their functional fixedness. Okay. We saw the candle box problem, I believe, didn't we? Did we cover that in this class yet?
I don't think so.
Maybe we don't.
No,
What's that?
No.
Okay. I think I cover it when we get into motivation. So anyway, using the items on top of the desk, how could you attach the candle to the wall above the desk so that when the candle burns, it does not drip wax onto the desk? What do you think?
Put it on the windowsill.
So the rules are, let's see, so attach the candle to the wall above the desk. So it has to be attached to the wall, and the candle, so when the candle burns, it does not drip wax onto the desk, okay? Anybody have an idea?
I mean, thinking crazy. I mean, you can pin the box of matches into the wall, take the matches out, though, of course, so you don't
Okay.
start a fire,
Okay, very good.
and then put the candle on top of it, I guess.
Oh, very good. Yeah, yeah, and that is overcoming functional fixedness. So looking at the design of the box, we're currently looking at holding the matches. However, if we overcome functional fixedness, we can use that box for something else, right? Use it for catching that candle from dripping onto the counter. Now they didn't attach to the wall, which I'm a little upset about, but anyway. So did anybody remember MacGyver? Was that something? I think they had a recent generation.
Best show ever.
Absolutely. The new one or the old one?
The old one.
I like the old one too. I saw the new one. It was okay, but
Yeah, it's different.
we could say MacGyver probably didn't have an issue with overcoming functional fixedness, right? Because he used various items in different ways that we never even thought about. Building a bike, turning a bike into a bomb or something. He was just brilliant that way. So anyway, so let's talk about creativity. Because when we're getting into problem solving, we want to consider what all options are and how we can use our mind to overcome certain issues, right? So solving problems by combining ideas or behaviors in new ways, right? So maybe we don't know how to create or build a car or build a bike or something, right? But we've built a scooter before. As an example. So if we know how to build a scooter, we start applying some of those concepts into our other problem, which is building a bike, right? So you may have certain design issues and ideas that you're using, but that's using creativity, applying something in new ways. That's the explanation of creativity. Now, I mentioned earlier divergent and opposite of that is convergent thinking. So essentially, this is using that creativity. So convergent, all lines of problem solving lead to a single answer. So we would use that. See if this gives me an example here. It does not. Okay. Oops. So with divergent creativity, time to harness. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm probably gonna take too long for y'all to get paper out, and I can't get out of this. All right, some of these lecture activities are not working. All right, so convergent, all lines of problem solving lead to a single answer, right? So if we have a goal in mind, we're looking to use very different avenues. Say we have different groups, they're all trying to solve the same idea, the same goal, right? Divergent, however, looks at many possible solutions to solving a problem. Does that make sense? So when we're using divergent thinking, we're starting from one point. We may not have the information, we may not have the resources, but we start coming up with different ways to get those resources to come up with different possibilities for our solution. Okay, so convergent, everything leads to one single answer, and divergent is we can have multiple answers to solve that problem. Okay, okay, there we go. So how do we get divergent thinking? And which one is better? Let me ask you, divergent or convergent? Does anybody have a preference?
Divergent.
Divergent? It's kind of a trick question. It depends on the application, okay? We may have, it depends on if we have flexibility. So for example, if we don't have time and a boss has an idea of what he or she wants to do to get to an answer, right? The manager has an idea what they want to get to. However, time is of the essence. Do we have time for divergent thinking? Probably not. So they would be more along the lines of using convergent thinking. So it really depends on the timing, the necessity, the risk, as to whether we employ divergent versus convergent thinking. But stimulating divergent thinking, we have different ways that we can do that. We can use brainstorming, come up with as many ideas as possible to think that without judging, each idea's merits. We just throw many ideas out there. I've seen idea walls. How many have used idea walls before, where you just come up with a card of an idea and you pin it up on the wall, and then you take them down as to whether or not they're feasible or possible. Right, that helps people. Getting in groups and doing brainstorming is oftentimes helpful because you have multiple avenues, multiple people coming up with ideas. Keeping a journal. So every time if you have a thought about something, some people use journals a lot. I do occasionally. If I have a thought that's important, I usually write it down, because if I'm thinking about something or I'm trying to come up with a solution to something and time goes on down the road, I may not be able to recall what it was I was thinking. So yeah, keeping a journal. Free writing is a great way for divergent thinking. I use this with my kiddos that I'm working with in therapy. I just let them write whatever comes to their mind and let them think about, like, if they're feeling a certain way about a parent or a relative or something, or even a friend. I've had people that had breakups, that teenagers that had relationship breakups, and they didn't know how to express that. So free writing is a way for them to do that. Have them write a letter to that person, regardless of what their feelings are, the other person's feelings are, with the goal that they will not turn in that letter. That kind of frees them up to express how they feel about this. And then we can kind of work backwards, work in that backwards method to say, well, why do you feel this way? How can you get over that, right? So free writing is super helpful with divergent thinking. And then mind or subject matter mapping. Start with a central idea and draw a map with lines from the center to other related areas. Again, kind of using that idea wall concept, but connecting those ideas and until your goals are met, right? All right. I don't know why that was spinning. All right. So for intelligence, what I would like to do before we get into intelligence is I would like to break us off into groups. This is probably a good stopping point here. So break us off into groups of 2 or 3, and I want 2 things that we're going to try and do. Okay, so if you want to write these down, I want a good definition of intelligence without looking it up. What does it mean to you? You can look it up in the book, you can look it up online, but let's not do that. Let's try and do this from our own brains and imaginations, because we're talking about creativity and problem solving today, right? So let's do it from your own brains and imagination and creativity. What is intelligence is one. So give me a good working definition of what intelligence is. It can be as short or as long as you want it to be. And the second thing is, how are we going to measure intelligence? What are we going to be looking at? What abilities, what thinking? How are we going to measure that? How can we put a person in a chair and either talk to them or give them tasks to find out if they're intelligent or not? What are we going to be measuring? Is everybody clear on what we're doing? What is intelligence and how do we measure it? Okay. Any questions? All right.
No.
Let me set up. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying no.
Oh, okay. Thank you. All right. So we'll have 4 groups, 3 participants per group. Okay. And your room should be open right now. I give you about 5 minutes. All right. So what did we all come up with? What solutions? So who? Let's go with group 1. How did you define intelligence?
So our definitions was understanding some sort of knowledge or information.
Okay. Knowledge and information. That's good.
Yeah.
All right. And how would you define? How would you evaluate intelligence? How would you observe it?
Being able to solve problems.
Okay. So walk me through, did your group come up with an example of how, like, maybe you would test somebody, like what kind of problems you would use to evaluate that?
We said something about like a IQ test, but then we thought about like it would be hard to measure someone's intelligence on an IQ test, so
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. And we kind of said we use IQ as a standard to measure somebody's intelligence. And we're going to talk about that in this lesson. But we have an idea of what intelligence is and how we evaluate it. But it's controversial because when we start mixing in different cultural beliefs and values, that could change dramatically with what a person's awareness is of their environment and even problem solving abilities, right? So we'll get to that. But using the IQ test, possibly, that might be a good strategy. How about group 2 or room 2? What did you come up with? What is intelligence?
A definition that I proposed was proficient knowledge in a certain area. And for the measurement, basically, we discussed kind of a well-rounded intelligence measure, testing, for testable knowledge. And my example I was thinking was, math, or actually where you have to actually sit down and, solve equations and, problems or whatnot, but as well as, measuring different tasks. And I use the word kinetic more, different measures within that regard to present an opportunity to showcase different types of intelligence.
Okay. So kind of using motor skills,
Mhm.
not only mental, but cognitive abilities, but motor skills as well, how they translate to, is that what you meant by kinetics?
Right, yes.
Okay. So kind of expanding on so group 1 said knowledge, being able to regurgitate knowledge or show understanding of knowledge, of their knowledge. And you're kind of expanding, group 2 expanded that out into, logic and,
Mhm.
and translating from what's in the mind to what's going out through the hands and body and expressions and stuff like that, right?
Mhm.
Okay. Good definition. Okay. All right. How about room 3? What'd you come up with for intelligence and how we measure it?
We kind of said something on the same lines, like I was comparing it to a placement test that I had to take for a math course, and to kind of gauge where you're at. But I also agree, like, you can't really measure someone's intelligence based on a test, so it's kind of like in between a little bit.
Right. Because again, what all we're doing with those evaluations is testing what they know and what they've been exposed to. So if they haven't been exposed to certain information, like such as English or literature or arts or math or something like that, can we say that they're not intelligent or they just haven't had the opportunity to learn it, right? So those are questions that come up with intelligence. And like I said, we're going to do a better job at defining this, but we're getting close. I think with all the groups here, let's see how group 4 did. What did you come up with intelligence and how to measure it?
So I think there's personally different like levels of intelligence, not like
Mm.
levels, but like different like categories. Like I feel like somebody could be really like knowledgeable about like school stuff, but not be knowledgeable about like worldly stuff, like common sense and like stuff in that kind of area. But then and then like vice versa. So like there's so many different like categories, I feel like, that there could be like
Okay.
measured. But like personally for me, I've been to like so many different schools and they each have like their own like testing that they would do to see like where like what kind of classes are like gifted classes or not gifted classes and stuff like that. So like, but you could also have a kid that's good at like math but not good at English, and then you have a kid that's good at English but not good at math. So like who's smarter? Like how do you like tell that? So I feel
Okay.
like there's no like one right way because there's so many different categories for it.
Okay, so like general abilities versus specific abilities. So, do we have somebody that's intelligent in a general, broad terms, and how do we kind of get balance that with, are they logical or are they artistic, or what certain abilities they have might determine like their general overall intelligence, right? Is that what I'm hearing there? So kind of looking at
Yes.
everything, the whole person concept. And I think, you know, with all 4 groups, I think we did a pretty good job at defining, getting to that point. We do want to look at a whole person. We can't just look at knowledge because they may not have been exposed to. We can't look at creativity because they may not have had the space to be creative. They may be able to understand something and learn something really well, but they haven't had the opportunity to be creative. They may not have exposure to world knowledge or world systems or concepts outside of their local village or town or city or wherever it is that they live. So global abilities might be a little lacking in that area, but they have creativity and they have word knowledge. So it's a very fluctuating and fluid understanding of what that is. And that was kind of our understanding initially. Let me share my slide with you here, of understanding initially what intelligence is what do we know? That's how scientists initially started looking at intelligence, and we found out much later that it involves so much more. So I will say that intelligence is probably one of the most hotly debated topics in the field of psychology and learning and education as well, because it is fluid and it's nothing that we can really say. We don't want to really operate in terms of labels saying whether somebody is more intelligent or less intelligent, right? Usually that serves some kind of purpose, whether they're getting into a program. Obviously, if somebody is lower on the intelligence side of things, we probably don't want to put them into a position where they are making important decisions, right? Educated decisions. Or getting into a program like an education program where they could likely not do well, right? Because that could lead to lowered self-esteem or lowered self-confidence if they're constantly put into positions where they are not poised to succeed. And that could be the danger. We look at that in Pennsylvania. You all have, well, I think just about everywhere they have IEPs, right? Individual education plans, right? What's an IEP for? What's that designed for? Anybody in the education or deal with an IEP? What is that for? Does anybody know?
I was in an IEP.
Okay. And so what was the purpose of that IEP?
Well, it was, I don't really know the details. I remember I was in a class that tended to my needs pretty much. I had emotional problems in school, so I needed an environment that best fit me and the help that I needed.
Right. That's
Because
exactly
I think
what.
differently.
That's exactly what it is. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead, Zach.
It's okay. I needed an environment that allowed me to work to my best ability.
Right. Because we have in our school system, we have we have a mainstream way of teaching students. Okay, and by mainstream, I'm not saying a single way, but we have certain teaching styles that teachers have. And if they encounter a student that has different needs or different abilities, let's say, for example, they are really, really good at math, but however, reading comprehension just isn't their cup of tea, right? So if we have somebody that's going to be more logical in using rote memory, that's probably not going to work well with that child. So that's the idea of an IEP, is to kind of give special considerations or different, letting that teacher know that maybe they need to slow things down, or they need to give more written work or recordings or something for that student to be successful in that class. Because if they're not successful, that could wreak havoc on their self-esteem, their self-confidence, their self-image, which could lead to fallout in other areas that they may have excelled in. So that's the idea with an IEP. And for intelligence, we use the same thing. You might have somebody that's really super intelligent with creativity and arts, but not so great with math. So being able to communicate that with the teacher will let them know what kind of intelligence that they are working with and what they might need a little bit more support with. Okay. So your book describes intelligence as the ability to learn from experience, acquire knowledge, and adapt. I want to key in on that word adapt, because it is probably the most crucial part of intelligence, is adaptability. We can learn from our experience. We can acquire knowledge, but if we don't overcome changes that occur, then intelligence really is, we can't really say that we see intelligence. Artificial intelligence, what is it? What is AI? Theoretically, do we have AI? Any sci-fi nerds out there? I'm one of them. So AI in its truest sense is artificial intelligence is something that mimics, or not, I'm sorry, mimics, has qualities of cognition that are similar to or greater than humans, okay? Because we know in order for somebody to be intelligent, we have to adapt and overcome our environmental strains or constraints. We haven't met a machine yet. I mean, I think we're close, but it's still programming by us. We are programming computers and machines to do what we would do. So anyway, just looking at intelligence, I don't think we're there yet where we have true artificial intelligence out there that that robots think and create the way that humans have. Okay, so adaptability is a big part of that. All right, so your book talks about Spearman's G factor, and this was developed by Charles Spearman, who saw intelligence as two different abilities. And and when your groups defined these, you came very close to the G factor and the S factor. Okay, so the G factor is general intelligence, like global intelligence. How do we adapt? How do we learn? How do we acquire? How quickly do we acquire? How expansive is our memory, right? Are we good at memorizing things, or does it take us a while? And then they look at S factors for intelligence, specific intelligence. Are they logical? Are they able to read? So those were some things. And then we had Gardner, who broke out those specific intelligence into 9 different abilities, okay? Verbal and linguistic, right? Musical, logical, visual spatial, movement, interpersonal, intrapersonal, naturalist, existentialist, right? So who are some people, like maybe in the media or characters in books or shows or whatever, who would you consider to be intelligent and why? Where would they meet on these 9 levels of intelligence, according to Gardner's theory?
I mean, I would go with Elon Musk, I guess.
Elon Musk, okay. In what way? What areas of these would you say he demonstrates intelligence?
Maybe, I don't know, number 3, just because of all the amazing technology that he can come out with. I mean, I know he's not the only one behind it. He has a lot of people that are getting him there, but
right,
I don't know,
right.
Yeah.
So he's, we probably wouldn't say he's musical. If he's musical, we don't know. So we're going to just base this as, going back to availability heuristics here, right? We think he's pretty logical and mathematical, right? He's probably visual spatial. I don't know about movement. He hasn't really demonstrated anything with movement. How about interpersonal and intrapersonal? Probably. I would say yes, right? Because he communicates, he's charismatic when he gets up in front of people. He's obviously successful. He's built a company. So intrapersonal, just to kind of define it. So interpersonal is relating to other people, right? Intrapersonal is building relationships. Okay, so strengthening those bonds and communication within that relationship, whereas interpersonal is going outside of those personal relationships to communicate. Hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. So kind of like intramural versus intramural. Intramural is outside of the school. Intramural is within that district or region or whatever, or within that school itself. Okay. Naturalist, I don't know much about that, or existentialist, whether or not Elon Musk is either of those two things. How about Oprah? Would you say Oprah is intelligent? Oprah Winfrey?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Yeah, I would agree. In what ways would you say she is? She's probably not, I mean, she might be logical and mathematical, but she's not known for that, or musical for that matter.
She's a talk show host. She knows how to talk to people. Very, people person. She's probably definitely a naturalist.
Yeah,
Or sorry, naturalist.
absolutely.
Sorry.
No. Yeah, I agree.
Interpersonal. Yeah, I'd say
Yeah.
has intelligence on many levels of these 9.
Yeah. So just because she's not logical or mathematical, so Elon Musk was logical. How about Albert Einstein? Right, we would consider him to be rather intelligent. When we think of intelligence, a lot of people do say Albert Einstein. Right, probably not musical, at least that I knew of. Not verbal or linguistic or even interpersonal or intrapersonal. Right. In fact, he was very much a recluse. Interestingly enough, did anybody know this tidbit of information that he was actually he was considered to be learning impaired through childhood?
Yeah, I think
Anybody
I did
else?
know
Yep.
that.
Yep.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
And yeah, nobody believed in him at all.
Right, because they were looking at interpersonal, intrapersonal. They were looking at his verbal and linguistic abilities, and he wasn't there. He had a mind that was very different. We would probably say it was almost along the lines of savantism, right? So what we look at savantism is when somebody is lacking in one of these other areas, but they're really, really good. Like Yo-Yo Ma, for example, is an amazing musician, right? We would say that, but if you ever talk to, I've never talked to him or anything, but he may not have a logical mind or mathematical mind. He may not be a naturalist or existentialist or anything like that, but very brilliant in the musical arts. So anyway, we look at that as a mark of intelligence as well. All right, so then we get to Sternberg's triarchic theory. Interestingly about Sternberg, Sternberg loves triangles. I don't know if I don't think we cover anything else with Sternberg, but Sternberg also developed relationship theories, marriage theories on how we have these triangles and we have 3 sides to it, and all of them stand for something. And if we have something that's a little bit lopsided to one side of the triangle or the other, that could show some kind of imbalance or some kind of problem in that area. So we always want to have a good, healthy middle ground here, like middle of the triangle. And that's kind of what Sternberg theorizes in some of these concepts. So his triarchy theory for intelligence looks at the analytical side to come up, breaking down problems down into their components, right? Looking at the creative side of things, dealing with novel problems in a new way. And then lastly, looking at the practical side, using information for success in life, right? Because if you look at that, we may be able to break down problems into components and be creative with that. But if we can't apply them to our current life situation, what good are they? Right? We're not overcoming anything at all if we're just using that. However, you have some people that might be able to use information to be successful in life. They may be very analytical, but they're not creative. So they might get stuck in that mindset that we were talking about earlier, where they have just one way of doing things, but can't think outside that box. Many of you have probably grew up thinking or heard the phrase book smart versus street smart. How many of you have heard that? What does that mean?
Yeah, I said that when you asked the intelligent.
Oh yeah.
Question. Yeah, I said that in my group.
Yeah. Okay. So what is book smart versus street smart mean?
Street smart is more like can get around. I don't know. I'll do book smart because I know that one better.
All right. Go ahead.
You very smart in school. Can read papers and analyze them. Very smart with school and things like that. And street smart more like can talk to people. Maybe if they're in a situation, they can try to get out of it. Something like that. But yeah. I said in my group, sometimes on an occasion you find people that are very book smart but not street smart. But on occasion you can find similar. They're both book smart and street smart.
And you're dancing around the word, and I think it's right there. And many of you are probably thinking this: common sense, right?
Yes,
Street
yeah,
smart is
common-
more
yeah.
like the common sense, where
Yeah.
you know what to do in certain situations. However, when it comes to reading some of the classic literature or reviewing art or something, somebody might not be smart in that area, right? So yeah, it comes down to common sense versus knowledge that we've been exposed to. And we can look at a person, again, looking at the whole concept of that person. Maybe they have that street smart, that practical information, but they don't do well in school because they haven't been exposed to that information, right? So looking at that whole person concept again. All right, so other intelligence theories. We have the Carroll, the CHC theory, which looks at crystallized intelligence versus fluid intelligence. And we have an example here, like as far as somebody that has crystallized intelligence is something that has worked for them over time. Okay, so things that, for example, learning to study. Many students had a different experience when they're going from high school to college. They had different study methods for that, what worked. Now, when they take those study methods and they try them in college and they don't work, what is the natural order of things happening? They try something different. Sometimes, most of the times, I find most students adapt and overcome, and they'll ask a tutor, kind of going back to the Vygotsky idea of learning, coming up with a tutor to help them with information and steps to reach their goal of getting a passing grade in that class. Students that can't overcome that usually tend to not continue to be on that trajectory of not studying well and not doing well, and sometimes going on academic probation until, again, they're acted upon by that outside force to do something different, do something better. All right, so the the CHC theory looks at that crystallized intelligence versus fluid intelligence through what we look at in broad domains. Okay, so acquired knowledge, what information were they exposed to based on their age and based on their culture. It could be a very cultural or global, depending on where they came from in the globe. It could be domain independent general capacities, right? So looking at reasoning, fluid reasoning, and short-term memory. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. Short-term versus long-term memory. We studied that last lecture. We're going to go a little bit more into that as far as what that looks like. What do we do with our short-term memory? We rehearse, we practice things over and over, we problem solve with that. When we put that into long-term memory, is that still accessible? Okay, so that's domain independent general capacities, or is looking at our memory and our reasoning. The third area, the third domain that CHC theory points out is sensory motor domain. I think it was group 4 or group 3 talked about that, right? Kinesthetics, right? Kinetics, I think is the word you used, right? But how do they translate what's in here to what's going on outside of their body, right? How do they move things around spatially and interact with their body in order to fine tune and help with problem solving, right? So looking at visual processing with that, tactile abilities, kinesthetic abilities, we said that already, and psychomotor abilities. And then we have general speed. At what speed can we process information, and how effective are we based on that speed? Because we can look at intelligence in that capacity. So, for example, if somebody solves a Rubik's Cube, for example, does that mean that they're intelligent? They can solve a Rubik's Cube in 30 seconds or less.
No,
There might be. You think so?
There's a certain pattern for it though, right? Like
Right.
yeah. So like if you just look up the pattern on like YouTube, does it make you smart though?
Right, exactly. Because I'll tell you, I solved the Rubik's Cube and I don't feel intelligent sometimes. But here, and I actually learned to solve the Rubik's Cube when I was connecting with one of my nonverbal patients. One of my clients came in and had experienced some trauma and just was nonverbal. He was not talking to anybody or doing anything, but he was committed to doing Rubik's Cubes. And I consider him to be very, very intelligent. But one of the things I started doing to connect with him is I had him teach me how to do the Rubik's Cube. And he taught me on the 2x2, and then he taught me on the 3x3. Now, using that, just because he taught me how to do that doesn't necessarily show a mark of high intelligence. It just shows that I can replicate what somebody else is showing me, right? So my acquired knowledge and short-term memory were certainly intact. Now, how quickly can I do that? How quickly can I learn new concepts? Because you're constantly, I don't know if anybody has ever done puzzles before, but you start out with what as a kid? Like a 4-piece puzzle. You go later on to like a 20-piece puzzle as you get a little bit older. And then you go into, has anybody done a 10,000 piece puzzle before?
I think like a 5,000.
I have.
I don't know about 10,000.
10,000?
Yeah, I have.
I think one time I did I don't even remember if it was like 10,000. It seemed to me like 20,000 piece puzzle of the blue sky, and I think I gave up. That was like, it still bothers me today that I've never completed that. But anyway, you see what we're doing is we're stepping up in ability and looking at that speed. How quickly do we gain that ability, and how quickly do we apply those new abilities, right? So that's basically what CHC theory is looking at. It just looks at those 4 domains, but it's including in that the speed at which we learn and replicate and process and even get in and become more creative in our abilities, okay? So how do we measure intelligence? Again, hotly debated. It started out with Stanford-Binet IQ test, okay? And put simply, the IQ is the standard that we use. And it's starkly different from what it used to be. How we initially developed it was the mental age versus the actual age of an individual. So for example, if we had a 10-year-old that if we gave them a test measuring their verbal skills, their motor skills, their working and short-term memory, based on that, they would see approximately about, I think the initial one was 800 or 1,000, might have been 1,000 individuals. 1,000 kids at 10 years old are able to answer these certain questions. Okay, so if that individual child that we test either rates below or above those questions, we can start deciding what their mental age is, right? So if that 10-year-old is answering questions that a 12-year-old was answering and solving problems that the 12-year-old was solving, we would say that child's mental age is 12, but his actual age is 10, giving us, if you know anything about math, giving us what? 120 IQ, okay? Which we know is pretty high. Now, if that child answered everything that a 10-year-old answered and his actual age is 10, that would be 100. So he's on par with his peers, everybody in his age group. Okay, so that's essentially how they used to measure IQ. Then we learned that there were some limitations to that, especially with culture and learning abilities and even socioeconomic. You know, certain kids had certain resources available to them that's maybe inner city kids didn't. So that played a big factor on that. So based on that, many decades later, we had a group that developed the Wechsler tests, okay? And they looked at more of those broad strokes of things. Instead of basing on that, we still look at their mental age versus their actual age, but it's much more complex. They look at verbal comprehension, they look at perceptual reasoning, they look at working memory, we look at processing speed. Now, verbal comprehension could be lacking. Again, if that child has not had access to an environment like an education environment where they were able to study books and learn words. So that may be lacking, but the Wechsler scale compensates for that by giving them a global abilities scale. Okay, so again, but if somebody was operating within their range of what their age group was, we would say that they're right around 100 IQ. Okay, somebody above IQ 120, 130, we would say that they start getting into the gifted ranges. Okay. All right. So looking at the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. Okay, these are just some of the items that they have on there. I'm going to go through these a little quicker here. So VCI, the verbal comprehension, uses similarities, looks at vocabulary, looks at information. How are they able to relate to that information, right? So those are just some things we look at verbal comprehension. With perceptual reasoning, the PRI, they use the block design. Has anybody done an intelligence test before? Some of you may have, and you just weren't aware that's what they were measuring.
Not that I know of.
Okay, the psychologist could be sneaky sometimes. They're measuring your intelligence and didn't even know it. But they use block designs to look at patterns to see how they can visually and spatially move things around in their mind and then translate that through their kinesthetic, their hands, right? Matrix reasoning, looking at patterns within certain numbers and symbols, right? And visual puzzles, again, looking at puzzles to how they can recreate based on what they've seen. Okay, we're gonna skip that video. All right, so test construction. In order to measure intelligence, we have to look at reliability. So many of you have maybe gone onto Facebook or got onto the internet and took some of those intelligence tests that were on there, right? They might use some puzzles, they might use some words, but generally they're only maybe a couple minutes long. Are those good tests? Do you think?
No.
Probably not, right? They're probably not. They're giving people labels based on very small amounts of information. They don't know the person's music ability. They don't know the person's interpersonal skills, right? So the things that we would look at that have the whole concept of adaptable and knowledgeable and able to use that information doesn't really get captured on those short tests. The WAIS and the WISC, the Wechsler child and adult ones, are a little bit more finer tuned, but they are reliable. So it has a tendency to test and yield the same results over the same conditions every time. So if that individual took that test and then took that test again 6 months later, they would probably be very stable and very, very similar. Mood doesn't have much to do with it. Energy and sleep and focus might, but for the most part, we won't see too much more than maybe a point or two variance in that. They have to be valid. So we look at validity. Is it the degree to which the test measures what it's supposed to measure? Is it actually measuring intelligence, or is it measuring something else? Is it measuring mood? Standardized basically means have they used this against a large number of people? Okay, did they get these test results? For example, if we went around to 1,000 people between the ages of 11 and 9 and asked them how to drive a car, right? How many of them would probably say yes? Not many, right? We would do that with each age group and to see which ones know how to drive cars. And as we get to about 14, 15, and 16, we're going to see more of an increase in answer on that. So, but the more people we ask, the more standardized that test is going to be. It's creating these norms. So a child that is answering questions at 10 years old that other 10-year-olds are answering, about 1,000 10-year-olds are answering, that would be a norm that was created on that test. Okay. But like I said, most tests that we use are highly unreliable. So when you're measuring, so many of you are going to be out in the field and you're going to be looking at intelligence as a means to gauge whether somebody is able to perform certain tasks or fit in with the classes. Keep in mind what exactly they're measuring. Like, for example, do ACTs or SATs measure intelligence, do you think? If somebody does,
No, I don't think so.
say it one more time, Madison.
Only like educational wise, like how smart they want the person to be, or how, I guess,
Right.
like trying to see how smart they are to get into the college or something.
Right. We call those achievement tests. What have they achieved academically? What have they learned academically? What have they memorized and being able to regurgitate? However, it does not show adaptability. It doesn't show logic, perceptual reasoning. So those reasons, those tests do not, just because somebody has high SATs does not necessarily mean that they have high intelligence. And we don't know how adaptable they are. They probably are. Chances are they are, because they got to that point, but we can't ascertain that without further testing. So just something for you all to keep in mind. How'd y'all like that? Did y'all like this? Did this help clarify cognition and what intelligence is?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Anybody have anything to add or any questions before we part today?
No, I don't think so. Oh, actually, one thing. So we have an article review coming up, but I saw the article peer review is due on the 4th.